Hi, I'm Othais, and this might be a little familiar. This is the Pistola a Rotazione Modello 1889 Tipo Truppa. Now, you may also know this as the Type A, as that is the name that it was given in sort of the wartime years. This is the original Italian Bodeo. Let's get it into the light box. With an overall length of 9.5 inches, you might be surprised to hear that it weighs in at just about 2 pounds. That is a very dense handgun. The cylinder capacity is 6 rounds, loaded singularly through the right-hand gate that uses the Abadi system. The cartridge is the 10.35 Italian Ordnance. If you're a regular viewer of the show and feel that it's important to catalog this gun history in detail, you may want to become a supporter over on Patreon or pick up some product over at the shop because we are funded by our viewers. Thank you. Longtime fans of the show know that we covered this particular hunk of literal iron early in our Primer series. Oh, the early days when I was burning 20 odd hours an episode just setting up those old 2D animations. Well, we have some more experience, some more help around the studio, and a lot more research material, but most critically, we actually have all the action examples that I didn't have when we filmed the original episode. Since the Bodeo is a fairly common collectible today, I think it's best to give it another harder look, so let's get into some more detail. This is the Italian Shamlo Delvin Modello 1874, a revolver you can likely tell we've covered before. The Shamlo was an excellent piece of technology at the time it was adopted. Great choice, Italy. Unfortunately, this was also a period of rapid small arms innovation, and by the 1880s, the shine was wearing off, although thankfully the major issues were fairly straightforward compared to more modern options. The 74 was just a bit too long and a lot too heavy to haul around all day. The action was fairly complex, and getting at it for service was too time-consuming. You may even lose a part or two along the way. Lastly, it could stand a few more automatic safety features. No one likes a negligent discharge. An initial solution to some of those problems would emerge again in the 1880s, actually. They shortened the Shamlo Delvin and made some minor lightning cuts. Done. Adopted 1888. I'm not kidding. Thankfully for Italy, that order would never really go through because despite adopting the shortened Shamlo, Italian Ordnance would soon catch on to a better solution that had emerged from the commercial market. You see, the big manufacturer making the 74 was Glisenti. Named for Francesco Glisenti, born in Storo in 1822 to a family of ironworkers in what was then Austrian territory, Glisenti was an active participant and organizer in the Italian Wars for Independence, making a name for himself politically and eventually commercially. Focusing on his industrial pursuits, Francesco, along with his brothers Isidoro and Constanzo, reworked a shuttered paper mill in Valtrompia into an iron workshop in 1859. Like so many other success stories in our series, the brothers Glisenti sought to modernize their facility as much as possible, and with commercial sales of arms underway, they started underbidding the government arsenals. Soon, they were producing a variety of rifles for both domestic and even limited international sales. By 1876, they secured a contract for 25,000 Vetterli rifles, and became cemented as an Italian martial institution. Having been contracted to produce the 1874 revolver, Glisenti, the firm, adapted the mechanism to commercial sales and as part of this approach, lightened, simplified, and added safety features to the handgun. Yet you can really see the influence that this commercial gun is going to have on our Bodeo today. The unusual thin and angled grip, the folding trigger, which was optional by the way, and a simplified swing-out ejector rod. However, while you might think this was just an early Bodeo, note that there are 3 pins in the frame, which means the internal action is very likely the same as the Shamlo. However, it does appear to have a side plate retained by a single takedown screw, so definitely easier to get inside than original 1874. Seeking police and paramilitary sales, the Glisenti revolver chambered the same 10.4 Italian Ordnance cartridge as that service Shamlo Delvin. In its original black powder form, it used a Tombac case 21.5mm case length and a flat-tipped lead bullet. In 1879, this was changed to a brass case and a rounded lead bullet. From the Glisenti model, the muzzle velocity should have been about 175 meters per second. Overall, this Glisenti commercial model was 5 centimeters shorter than the 1874 and over 300 grams lighter. It's not too bad. While Glisenti's gun was pretty neat, it sadly did not solve all of the Italian army's concerns. Most notably, it was still using that complicated chamelot action, and this is where the history gets sketchy again, opaque. There are 3 Italian patents, one filed in 1886 and 2 more in 1889, and they all combine to form the gun that I have here, and they were all granted to one Carlo Bodeo, who I know nearly nothing about except that he was a native of Brescia, formerly lived in Rome, and then in Napoli, and he was an arms maker. Honestly, if not for a trail of court reporting, I'd think he was invented specifically to secure these patents, but I guess he's a mystery for another researcher another day. Let's look at what we do know, however, which are really his patents. The first, from 1886, is extremely similar in appearance to the Glisenti model, and I'm not really sure which came first. What makes it distinct are several key features: a greatly simplified lockwork, an oiler stored in the grip, and a manual safety, which also appears to be the takedown screw. Now, I'm going to admit something here. Revolver actions are, for some reason, very hard for me to lock into my brain. We all understand when a certain auto-loading pistol is a rotating bolt versus a toggle lock versus a tipping lock versus an inertial lock. We even understand minor differences in swinging links versus camming surfaces quite well. But when revolvers have a different method for lifting the hammer or rebounding it automatically, I've noticed that many firearms experts, myself included by the way, sort of draw either a complete blank or weird associations that don't make a lot of sense. I have repeatedly seen this simple action being quoted as an improved chamelot Delvine, but I'm sorry to say that just seems to be dead wrong to me on further analysis. This is a simplified depiction of the chamelot Delvine as adopted in the Italian 1874, and this is the eventual basic Bodeo action. Just by example, notice how different the hands are alone. Now this action, this is a revolver of Belgian make that competed against the chamelot way back in 1874. This is a Fagnus action, which I believe is a further evolution of the Perrin double action, but that's going to take more research. The point is, we often do not clearly trace revolver lineages, and I may soon find that the Fagnus simply copied someone else, maybe Warren, who was known for inventing the rebounding hammer in the first place. But I'm going to try to be a little bit better going forward to actually analyze these actions, and maybe we'll start to see some interesting patterns emerge. Anyway, the first Bodeo patent clearly infringes on the Fagnus, but that hardly matters because at the time Italy had similar patent laws to the ones that we're accustomed to in Spain. If you aren't producing in Italy, your patents do not count. So Bodeo snatched up the action, and in 1889 he grabbed 2 more ideas. First, the Abadi loading system, in which opening the loading gate compresses the nose of the hammer and keeps it disengaged for the duration. That means you can pull the trigger, indexing the cylinder to the next empty chamber or spent casing without actually firing the gun. We of course just saw this in our recent Portuguese Abadi episode. In his second 1889 patent, Bodeo secured a new ejector rod system, in which a collar was placed around the barrel, allowing the rod to be swung into the path of the right-hand chamber. This was also a well-established invention in Belgium, where we've already seen it on the Nagant 1878, and it likely existed for many years before. Oh boy. So it seems that Bodeo wasn't so much an inventor as he was an amalgamator. From here, it gets a bit fuzzy again. I didn't turn up any records of testing by the Italian government. Instead, I just know that they like the Bodeo revolver so much that they would adopt it officially in October of 1889, at which point the previous year's adoption of the shortened 1874 was discarded, apparently with no production that is known of. Which is when we get this firearm right here, the 1889 Bodeo. So let's go ahead and get a closer look. Okay, I think just from the contour of this gun, you can understand why the Italians like to call it the leg of lamb. That is a bizarre grip. We'll talk about that more with Mae, won't we? Now, outside of this unique handle, what else is going on here? Well, we have a fairly straightforward revolver. Here's the barrel. Here's our ejector rod. What is going on here? This is a safety device. So the idea is we don't really trust the enlisted men not to shoot themselves on the draw. So we want to make sure that when you draw the gun, there's no trigger to shoot yourself with. Instead, that trigger will only pop. Actually, I may have to do this with the front camera. That trigger is supposed to only pop, I should say, because a lot of these have worn out over the years, once you manipulate the hammer. You don't even have to get it all the way back, but it's just enough. See how it wiggles the trigger to the rear because it's going to pull that trigger with it? That allows it to pull free of this particular spring. Let me see. There you go. See that spring that's set up off the front of the gun? And then the hammer or the trigger clips right in there, and then it doesn't fall out unless you again boop the doodle. All right. Interesting safety feature. I find that it's very awkward to handle guns that don't have trigger guards. Just because usually you want something for your middle finger to rest up against for leverage when you're cocking the hammer. You get the idea, but this was seen as a worthy safety and stayed with the gun for its entire service life. This was never, refitted with a solid trigger to my knowledge. Wow. Okay, this is a gate loader, and the gate is the Abity system. So, just like on our most recent episode, we should be able to, look at that. Cylinder moves, but hammer doesn't. That is fantastic. And then once she's closed, again, we're back to actual live fire. So it's pretty cool. Now, I should probably say while I'm over here for ejection. So we've spent all of our rounds. We will pull forward on this little guy. Click, right? And then we'll roll her over and then all the way out and ka-tink. And then back forward and you'd pull your trigger and ka-tink. Ka-tink, and you get the idea. As a matter of fact, half the time I end up pulling it too soon and banging on that, and that's a real worry, is that you're gonna bend this rod, which is why that rod is one of the few steel components on this gun, because the Bodeo, I was about to say Abity, the Bodeo is an iron-framed gun. As a matter of fact, the steel parts are limited. Barrel, cylinder, I believe the hammer and trigger, all of the interior springs that we'll see in a moment. I'm told the gate is actually steel, which is weird. I don't know why that would be necessary to be steel, but the rod is steel as well to prevent that deformation because it is so thin. Now, being an iron frame gun, we're going to see there's some limitations to this guy, but that certainly does help with being able to manufacture them quickly. And by the way, if this one looks particularly rough, I assure you it's actually not that bad, because these guns were originally in the white. It wouldn't be until, as far as I understand it, post-World War I that they started refinishing the troopers models into being blued. So it's very common to see them blued today as part of refurbishment, but at the time, this would have looked fairly correct, if a little, old and worn. The sort of unfinished steel was unfinished iron to a degree, polished, but not coated. This is correct. Okay, so what else can we do with our Bodeo? Well, we can get into it very easily, because don't forget, it's not just about being lightened and simplified off the Chamelot Delvine. It's about being able to get into it. So they have a thumb screw, a captive thumb screw, right here at the rear. So as we turn it, it stays in place in its side plate, and it just goes ahead and lifts that side plate off. As a matter of fact, it's prying the side plate off for us so that we get to this point, we just flip her on over, and we're in. That's actually pretty handy. Now, once we look at the action, we're going to find one of the simplest possible revolvers known to man. This particular design, as far as I have been able to track it back, is original to, well, it goes back to the Nagants. They then go back to the other version of the Galland, but Galland may have taken some of this from Perrin. I'm going to have to walk this down a lot further one day. However, this is uniquely Bodeo in the sense that it has been combined with no trigger spur. The lower spring is the tensioning arm for the hand. We're going to see this in more detail in the animation. Despite the very few number of parts in this gun, a lot of operations are happening, and it's all being done by essentially two springs. This big V spring, and then one up in the nose to do the nose's job. This is realistically as simple as a single and double action revolver can get, and just to prove that, there's our single action, right? That's the simple part. And then if I pull the trigger, oh God, it's stiff. That's gonna push up on that nose, eventually free the hammer to drop. I don't want to dry fire it. You get the idea. This is done. I don't know of a way to do this more minimally. I'm not gonna lie. This is extremely simple and very, very impressive, even if it is a slight amalgamation of another idea. I love this design. This is beautiful, right? This is design. And if nothing else, if you laugh at the entire gun, appreciate how simple this is. I can't sell it enough. All right, we want to further disassemble our gun, right? We're not just going into the side plate. What do we do? Well, we're going to pull our pin again, index this guy over, and we're going to align him. Let me see if I can get to the front where you can see. We're going to align him so that we can pull this plug out. Now this plug is often very stiff, and it's extremely common to see damage on the sides of the frames right here. This one's been henpecked as well with a hammer because people try to pull this out and it just, yeah, it doesn't want to go. As a matter of fact, this guy with all of his age and everything else has also gotten stiff. I find that a nylon punch is the way to go so that I don't tear up the gun. And then I'll just give it a couple taps. Yep, she's not quite moving. Let me get that lined up a little bit better. Always harder to do things on camera. Let's see. Just a couple taps to get her started. While in the correct alignment, while showing it to a camera is always fun. Obviously, this is not an expedient field repair, probably because of the iron gun. All right, so as it starts to come free, you'll see what's going on. We have a slot that's starting to appear, and that works against this screw so that when you pull it out enough, it does not actually come all the way out of the gun so you don't lose it. It's actually captive. And then our cylinder's free, so that means if we open our gate, then she can come on out, and then we can see pretty basic cylinder, nothing fancy going on there. So fairly smart though, right? Because if we've gotten this far into the gun, what have we created for a mess? Well, as many parts as possible are captive. The only thing I could argue is maybe putting this on a hinge to keep it attached to the gun, and then maybe having a way to keep the grip clip down, but fairly minimal in the amount of parts we create, and also the ones that we do create are very large. They're not easily lost, which makes this, again, a very intelligent gun. I want to point out, it absolutely ripped off everybody in sight. I don't know that there's a single original idea in here, but the combination is frankly brilliant. The execution may leave something to be desired when we actually shoot it, but engineering-wise, everybody enjoy this for just a moment. Okay. All right, that was a little cursory, so let's get a better look at what all's happening with an animation.
First, we'll open the loading gate, which has an internal projection that compresses the hammer nose. With the nose tucked out of the way, pulling the trigger no longer cocks the hammer, which means we can index the cylinder to the next empty slot by just pulling the trigger. Once filled up, we can close the gate, and the nose is released. However, we'll start firing in single action, which means manually cocking the hammer. At full cock, its lowest foremost projection locks against the trigger's highest rearmost projection, which means just a light pull and bang! Let's see that again, this time focusing on the trigger. See how the hammer's projection raises against the triggers until click. While we're here, also take note that the trigger is acting as the cylinder stop, with this projection engaging one of 6 notches in the cylinder whenever the trigger is pulled. Okay, again, we can fire with a light pull. In double action, we pull the trigger, and its rear projection pushes up on the nose, which in turn tips the hammer back until it slips free. The heart of the Bodeo is its ingenious use of a single V-shaped mainspring to accomplish 4 operations. First, and most obviously, the upper arm of this spring biases the hammer forward. Second, the lower arm rests on the hand, biasing it towards the cylinder, causing it to spin when raised. On releasing the trigger, the hand can skip back down the ratcheted cylinder teeth. In the same motion, the third operation is accomplished, as the same spring pressure also presses the trigger back forward. And finally, the fourth operation is to rebound the hammer. Notice the special shaping of the lower arm, which, when we release the trigger, puts pressure at the lower rearmost projection on the hammer, causing it to bounce back slightly. The Abity-style gate also works for unloading along with this ejector rod, which you simply pull forward, rotate over, and alternate pulling the trigger and pressing and withdrawing the rod. Alright, time to go shoot it.
Trigger. Italy didn't just update their revolver, they also updated their cartridge. Don't forget, by 1889, we're already in the land of smokeless powder. Italy was already in trials for what would be their new small bore rifle, so why keep a dirty, easily fouling black powder revolver cartridge? So they'd fix it in 1890. This was of course backwards compatible with the 1874 Chamelot Delvines, as they were still largely in service. The case length was shortened to 19.5 millimeters, but still had to use a cotton wad to take up some of that interior space, as the hotter smokeless powder took up so little. The bullet was changed as well, now jacketed and making minimal contact with the rifling thanks to a skirted shape, which kept pressures low and velocity high, now up to 248 meters per second. Like I said earlier, this was considered the trooper's model. It was meant for common soldiers whose duties called for a handgun and, more commonly, NCOs. Of course, this left out the proper and educated officers. Well, what would they carry? Well, that would actually be this, the officer's model, or as it would later be called, the Type B. Ditching the folding trigger and including a handguard, this particular revolver would have been blued, but that's long since been rubbed off on our example here. Also, do not mind that odd protrusion. I'll explain what it's about in just a moment. Same cartridge, 6 shots, and ever so slightly heavier. I think you get the idea. The officer's model was adopted formally in June of 1891. It was initially offered to general staff and then spread from there to encompass the Carabinieri, Navy, artillery, etc. and so forth. Its issue was not extended to the cavalry at first, as they had decided to stay with the longer-barreled, heavier revolver 1874. They preferred it. They would only come around to the Bodeo in 1894. The officer model, or Type B, was purchased by the individual officer and remained their personal property. The initial cost was 28 lira, plus 2 more for a holster. If a young officer couldn't afford this lump sum, he could finance it for 2 lira a month. Each officer was issued 3 packages of 6 shots each, for a total of 18 shots during mobilization. Alright, I suppose we should probably get a closer look. Boom! Alright, ignore this shape right here. As a matter of fact, this doesn't exist. Don't even look, okay? There is no rod on the side of the gun. Instead, just look at the overall shape. Do you notice anything? We have a regular trigger and a regular trigger guard. It's like magic. Everything else is the same as the trooper's model, except it shouldn't be. This gun is in the white, just like the trooper's was. It's not supposed to be. As a matter of fact, it's probably supposed to look more like just this grip area. It's supposed to be a blued gun. Something went wrong here in this gun's history. So imagine that it's deeply, wonderfully blued. It still has the normal trigger guard. That's all correct. Another way to recognize an officer's, or at least to understand something about them, is if we look on this side, it should be incredibly boring, unlike the troopers. Let me get that guy back out, because the troopers were government property. The officers were not. So if you look, I got a stamping here. This is a serial number. This particular one says I for indigo and then 8315, right? Stamped right there at the rear. Nothing here. Nothing here, as a matter of fact, although there may be, depending on the manufacturer. Instead, this particular one being made over in Brescia, this guy is only going to be marked deep under the grips by assembly numbers. This never had a serial number per se. because it wasn't part of government property. It just belonged to whoever bought it. Technically, this is an obsolete feature that was largely removed from Bodeos in service. Officers' models, well, they tend to be the best way to see these sorts of abandoned components as they were private property and were not always sucked up by the state into re-arsenaling programs. So why is that bar there? Well, let me show you something. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and get this guy out of the way to prevent confusion, because if I remove this, then we have an original factory Bodeo, right? Super simple mechanism that we've already seen in a fair amount of detail. But there's a problem. The way this gun's set up, like we've already seen, this pressure back here rebounds the hammer so that it wants to bias. Actually, let me do it the other way. I fire it, it wants to bias back. That's good. That keeps our firing pin out of the way of other rounds, and it provides a fair bit of extra safety, right, than just having it sit there and drag. Problem is that spring pressure is all that's doing this. So if you really exert force on this guy, look what I can do. And that kind of force is the exact kind of thing you might get if you were to drop this gun on the ground and you hear that click? That's a bang click. That's no good. And you may not know this, but people have a habit of butterfingering just about everything in their lives. This is potentially dangerous. There were apparently numerous reports of accidental discharge, and so the Italian authorities wanted to fix this issue right away. Unfortunately, they disagreed on how to do so, especially economically. Apparently, proposals for various hammer blocks or hard rebounds started coming in around late 1892. The first offerings were all deemed too expensive, but by March of 1893, several more reasonable designs had emerged. The Army and Navy then got into a bit of a squabble, let's be honest, about which system they would like to use. Ultimately, the Navy would select a system that I'm actually going to talk about in a moment, but the Army worried it would be too weak, and so they stalled, which actually theoretically paid off for them, sort of. Because in May of 1893, they were approached by an artillery officer named Michel de Lauzo, and it's his proposal that the Army would ultimately accept, which is what is on this gun. So let's get a look at how that works. All right, so we have our officer's model again, and we want to fix this problem. We need a hammer block, right? Well, the way the de Lauzo safety did it is to add this guy to the side plate. And as you can see, he goes all the way through and there's a notch right there, okay? And this actually has a slope to it, and it interacts with, what? Oh, that interacts with our rising hand, actually this lower spring and rising hand. Now, what's that gonna do? Well, it's actually not unlike the Gasser 1870 with that side hammer block, only this one's more vertical. And the L portion of this, let me see if I can get where you could see that. The L portion of this is going to get in front of the hammer so that when the hammer tries to fall, it can't actually make contact with a primer. Now, we need it to get out of the way. So in order for that to work, when it's in the gun, let me get it assembled. And we'll see if we can see it from this angle, and then I'll try it from the front as well. When it's in the gun, if we cock back the hammer manually all the way, see it rising? Well, same with the trigger, right? What it really is tied to the trigger. It's just hard for me to do that on camera. So as this guy comes back, properly back, it gets flexed out of the way. And if we continue to hold the trigger, while we're holding the trigger, it stays out until we release it. Once we release the trigger at any point, see how it cams in? Well, that's gonna block the hammer and prevent the gun from firing. So the gun can only fire when we've intentionally pulled the trigger all the way to the rear. Let me see if I can get that into a position where you can see it from the front. Actually, this is a little bit easier for you to see and I won't have to shoot myself. So see it flexing out of the way? Hammer can fall. If we get the hammer back and I let go of that trigger, it's gonna be in the path of the hammer and therefore the hammer can't fall. Hammer can fall as long as I hold it. Hammer can't fall if I let it go. That's pretty handy. This change was approved by the Army in March of 1894 and applied to all new production in addition to starting a conversion program. Officers had the option to send in their revolvers for adaptation, but were trusted enough to make the call themselves. So when Bodeos without any sort of safety at all show up, they're usually the officers' models. Anyway, with that covered, let's go ahead and let Mae take some shots out of this guy. All right, 2 down, but I have a surprise in store for all of you. Remember I said that the Army and Navy differed on what safety mechanism to add to the Bodeo? Well, that's not all they differed on. The Navy only adopted the folding trigger Type A variant, purchasing 7,200 from Glicenti and Glicenti only. These were constructed with barrels 2 centimeters longer than the Army's. Navy Bodeo have their serial stamped on the right front side of the frame. The Navy already had 6,000 Modello 1874s, which they initially retained. However, they declined to repair them when broken. At least, they declined to keep them as Chamelot Delvines. One man, only referenced in record as Chief Viteo, proposed 2 solutions to the Italian Navy. The first was a means of adding a hammer block to the action of a Bodeo revolver. And the second was a means of converting the Chamelot Delvines that were in service and falling out of service into Bodeos. Kind of like this one right here. Lightbox! This unique critter is a Modello 1874 Chamelot Delvine that has been converted into the Bodeo pattern, and the differences are not just external. Happily, it still chambers the same 10.4mm cartridge and loads and handles just the same as the 1889 Type A. That's right, as the 1874 revolvers wore out, they were reconditioned into the Bodeo pattern, which actually results in something I find to be a little fantastic. So let's take a closer look. Now, when a mommy Chamelot Delvine 1874 and a daddy Bodeo 1889 love each other very much, well, this is what happens. An abomination unto humanity. This is the Chamelot Delvine Bodeo. I don't even know how to get this one tighter, and I actually technically don't know the official designation of this gun. I just know that it exists. From records, this was done by Viteo, as well as a safety mechanism which we can see inside. But before we get there, let's talk about where this thing is a Bodeo and where it's a Chamelot Delvine. From the outside, it's very Chamelot Delvine. It's got the Chamelot Delvine, actually, let me see. Oh, good lord. Okay, there's our ejector rod that we're so used to. We have a gate system that doesn't quite line up, so you're still kind of manually activating it, even though actually it does have the Abadie internals. So if I were to, oh wait, hold on, can't do that, there we go. So if I open that gate and pull the trigger, our hammer's vaguely moving, but it's not enough to fire the gun. However, the alignment is just not there. So if I show you at the rear here, we're not quite lining up with the ejector rod. I'll boot that around. Yep, stuck. I've got to just sort of boop and then it works. So you're not getting all the Abadie features, but you're getting a little bit of the safety. In terms of taking this thing apart, the wing here is the same. They've taken that over from the Bodeo and actually created the cuts to have the side plate so that we can go in. Before I get into too much detail in here, everything comes out like the Bodeo. If you want to remove that central axis pin, we're not going to do it, but it's the same as the Chamelot Delvine. You push on this guy and pull out the pin, which is different from the Bodeo, obviously. Now, you know what? I'm going to get it in just a little bit tighter so you can see this. Oh yeah, we are all Bodeo. Type A, first type, trooper type safety as adopted by the Navy. Safety trigger, I should say, not safety. In folding, obviously. Then we have the simple V-spring. This is way easier than the old Chamelot Delvine. As a matter of fact, we have a whole episode on the Chamelot Delvine, but yeah, look at this, all right? Look at the parts count. Here's a spring, there's a sear, there's this inverted hand thing, there's a separate spring for running that, hand there, and then we have this V-spring here for running the trigger. I mean, just look at the hand, hammer, pusher, hand, spring, sear. Okay, right? Now let's go back on this. We've already talked about them, but oh yeah, come on. Ignore this little crossbar and otherwise look at what all's missing, right? Now in order to get this done, they had to create a plug that they fit and then staked into place in order to hold the simplified V-spring, but that's really all there is to it besides some minor contouring and fitting. Like, this actually is a pretty smart little system. Good job, Viteo. Now, by the way, I just sort of am to understand that he did this conversion system. What I know is that he's the one that did this particular safety system. So this is a hammer block just like the other one, but instead of flexing in and out, it rises and falls and relies on a specific cut made in the side of the hammer. So if I were to pull the trigger, we'll see that this block rises, right? If I close the gate so the hammer actually moves, the block will rise until it meets this particular notch in the hammer and allows the hammer to fall all the way forward. If that block is lower, see how it's there? And I'm sorry it's such a hard C. Well, then the hammer can't go forward. It's blocked. So bunk, 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 bunk. If I pull it up, then dink, dink, dink all the way down. It really is that simple of an operation. The reason the Army did not care for this system is because you had to significantly shave down the hand in order to accomplish that. So let me go get the other guy real quick. Take me just a second to open her. Look at the difference. Big, chunky hand, little skinny hand. And there was a lot of fear that this would become a vulnerable part from the Army, so they went with the DeLauzo instead. Now these guys are fairly rare in the market. Even if the Navy converted all of their Chamelot Delvines, they still could only really number 6,000. And I doubt they got through all of them. Anyway, this one's in pretty good shape, so you know what? Let's let Mae shoot it. Now, I want to be honest, we usually borrow for this show. I managed to get this for myself years ago by trading a Berthier to a certain mustachioed gentleman for it. Now, as for those Naval Bodeo 1889s, in theory, they should have been somewhat plentiful. Since the Italian Navy would adopt the C-96 in 1899, their revolvers would largely be surplused in the 1920s, and yet Naval 89s are an extremely rare sight today. I suspect the bulk of them must have been purchased by some foreign power or exporter to China or something like that, or maybe a commercial interest converted them and we just don't know about it. I don't know what the black hole is, but definitely Naval Bodeos have been swallowed up by history. Okay, we have the Army Type A and B, the Navy Type A, and the Navy converted Chamelots. They're all covered. We've talked about the DeLauzo safety and the Viteo safety, along with the conversion, obviously. And while all that was going on, well, remember how I said they adopted a smokeless powder cartridge in 1890? Well, while testing the various safety devices, they discovered a new problem. The frames were slowly failing. Repeated use of harder hitting smokeless powder was beginning to distort the area of the frame around the firing pin, so much so that some revolvers were embossed enough that firing a shot would cause a jam as the spent case was buried in the frame, preventing rotation. The solution was actually fairly simple. You take your old revolver, you bore out the affected area, and replace it with an, the iron. You replace the iron with a steel slug, which in turn was reshaped to fit and bored out for the firing pin. For the Army, this would be 9mm in diameter. The Navy opted for 11mm, but comparative testing later on revealed no real difference between the two choices. Steel plugs were added to new production, and as older guns came in for repair, they would get the same modification. Again, officers' guns often escaped this update. It was, again, up to the officer to notice the damage and submit his revolver for repair, and oftentimes nobody did. Now, testing of the steel plug system required the Army and Navy to subject their revolvers to thousands of rounds of fire. These endurance tests then revealed another flaw, this time in the ammunition. The Model 1890 cartridge cases were splitting at an unacceptable rate. So in 1899, an improved cartridge was again introduced. This largely was identical to the previous, though now the case was thicker walled, especially at the base, and had a different taper on the rim. Basically, minor geometric changes to prevent failures of the case. Alright, at this point I've almost caught us up to the revolver that we started the show with. But before I can get there, I need to start talking about production of the Bodeos so that this will make any sort of sense. Type A's were initially produced by Fabbrica d'Armi di Brescia, who took the A and C prefix series, so upwards of 20,000 units were possible. However, known serials say otherwise. A rough estimate makes for 14,000. Glisenti took on the B series, finished the C series, and carried on into the E series with a high of E7100 that we know of. Type Bs were also produced at both facilities, with perhaps as many as 10,000 from Fabbrica d'Armi di Brescia, running from 1891 to 1893, and the same from Glisenti, though they ran production more slowly until 1906. It's worth mentioning, about the time the Bodeo was adopted, ownership of the Glisenti firm was passed down to son Alfredo, who did his best to keep the business running, but after his death in 1906, the company crumbled, and the arms wing was bought up by Metallurgica Bresciana Tempini in 1907. With Glisenti down, revolver production actually halted entirely, although it seems that the Italian army was satisfied with the inventory that they had. I'm certain private manufacture of officers' models must have carried on in some capacity, but from here on they became a little bit more scarce. That's likely due to a growing interest at the same period in automatics. Ultimately, that interest would result in the adoption of the Glisenti 1910, which should have displaced the Bodeo, but before production could really get going, Italy was involved in a war. The Italo-Turkish War, to be exact, which saw an unusual mix of old world and new, and created more demand for armament. So a new producer would be found, and the hero to step forward? Toschi e Castelli, which was a partnership between Napoleon Castelli and Giuseppe Toschi. And with the start of their production, another mystery appears. Somewhere in the gap between 1906, when Glisenti stopped production, and 1911, when Toschi and Castelli started production, a decision was made that the Dalauzo safety would have been better off named the Dalauzi safety? Okay, fine. Seriously though, this particular weirdness was too prone to damage, and it can be fouled up and snagged, and it's a pain to clean under, and it's ugly. Let's be honest, it's gotta go, right? Well, what replaced it? Because it couldn't be the Navy's Viteo, that weakened the hand too much. Well, they found a further simplification of that Viteo mechanism, of course. It originally is in this gun. I took it out to show it to you earlier. I've since magically replaced it. Let's get a closer look. All right, folks, I'm going to show you a little magician's trick because I have lied to you right at the start of the show. This is a 1915 Castelli, which means that it has an updated safety. And it always had an updated safety, which is right there, the second Viteo type. I stole the hand out of our Dalauzo officers in order to show you it earlier so that you wouldn't get confused by me going all out of order. Now, this was added when production was resumed, and this is a lot simpler than the Dalauzo, and it's tucked out of the way. It's also simpler than the Viteo in one sense, which is that, yeah, okay, we gotta drill a hole here and make this funky shape, but we don't really weaken the hand. We just have this one little notch out of it, and it doesn't slop around in here. Instead, it has just a little bit of rebound room in here for it to kind of waddle, and otherwise it does its job. So how does this one work? The exact same way as the first Viteo. And we're not even sure who introduced this one. So if I pull the trigger, it rises, and there's a notch cut in the hammer that you guys can see. and then that notch lines up with the falling hammer. Actually, better than the first Viteo. It's a fuller shape. And then, boom, that's a good fire. Whereas if I were to drop this, when the hammer comes down, it's gonna kunk up against that metal. That's really all the magic. But if you think about it, you get a solid hammer block with the addition of one part and one not even a complete hole drilled into the side of the hand. That is very economical. And so this was done retroactively to every revolver in service. It's actually extremely hard to find a Type A that does not have this. As a matter of fact, if you want to find any of their systems, you have to find them from officers' models, which are also rare for those years. Or, like we got lucky, you find a Navy model because they went with a different system and didn't always go back and do this modification. Thanks to this update, it's almost impossible to find an original DeLauzo Type A. Again, officers' models didn't always get the upgrade, so that's why we were able to have this time capsule. Anyway, back to production. Toshi and Castelli would produce from the F series through the N series under this particular moniker. Then in 1916, it appears that Toshi either left or passed away as the guns began being marked MIDA, standing for Manifattura Italiana d'Armi Castelli. From here, they produced until 1918, hitting the AH block and then changing to Mida Brescia and carrying on until 1919, hitting the high AL block. It's worth noting that some letters were never used or were assigned to other producers, so these don't represent an accurate total in and of themselves. I highly recommend the reading material that is always in the description of these videos if you'd like to research your serial specifically. Now, during the war, a number of the officers' models were also apparently pulled from the storage and finished from incomplete inventory or recycled from officer trade-ins, whatever the case may be. These surplus officers' models occasionally appear with regular prefix serial numbers, meaning that they made their way into Army inventory and were being issued as if they were the same as the Type A folding triggers. Okay, so to review on domestic production, Fabbrica di Brescia, Placenti, of course, Toshi and Castelli, which became Mida Brescia, and post-war, a bit of a spoiler, some were made by Bernardelli and possibly by Beretta, but that does not count a myriad of copycats, mind you. This would be a complete list if not for the fact that imports became necessary when war were declared. Entering the Great War, Italy would soon be entangled in the same problems as every other nation, namely severe armament shortages. Thankfully, their standard revolver was practically designed for easy manufacture, especially by hand. These iron-framed Bodeo were actually perfect for our favorite friends in Eibar, Spain. These craftsmen were put to work by the French and British during the war. The Italians would also join in. Actually, we know that they'd buy their own Ruby pistols and Ona revolvers to speed things up. But they also contracted for Spanish-made Bodeos. These came from 3 companies: Arismendi y Goenaga, Relogio Arostegui, and Antonio Erasti. Each company submitted their own revolvers to Italy for serialization, so they are frankly scrambled in terms of provable production numbers. However, it's roughly estimated that 30,000 or so in total were produced in Spain. Now, 2 out of 3 of those companies worked through an importer in Rome, so they will also have a marking of Scolari, which explains that stray mark for any of you curious. Now, as for the service, well, the Bodeo was ubiquitous, and so there's little basis for comparison to other systems by the troops. Overall, they seem to have held together fairly well, proving to be a reliable companion in unreliable times, which is high praise for such a dead simple and frankly cheap handgun. Honestly, that ease of construction was a major boon, and it estimated some 230,000 or more were produced through the war. Following 1918, the Bodeo still continued in service, while more and more of the officers' models poured into paramilitary or civilian police use. There was also a refurbishment program with most of the work done in the mid-1920s, and it appears to have actually largely been directed at the Spanish-made guns. As a matter of fact, we have one of those refurbished Spanish-made guns right here, so why not? Let's take a quick look. Okay, we have a refinished Bodeo. Now in this case, this one's Spanish. You can usually tell by the poorer finish, the poorer fitment of parts, and in particular, these guys right here, the ejector, they tend to be softer edged and kind of, you can tell it's handmade. Most Spanish guns are obviously just going to be marked by the Spanish manufacturer, and if you get really into the weeds on these, which we're not going to do today, you can recognize the internal markings that are left over even after the refinishing process. Generally though, with these refinished guns, they're going to grind off that original marking. They're going to mark it on the right hand side with the update date, so this is 1926, and it's going to have its new serial number, CS, on this case 1970, which is not a date, that's just the serial number. The date's below it on the line there. Now, the other critical thing obviously is that it's been blued. It's been probably reworked and refitted where necessary in order to get it back in time and running well, and then they go ahead and mark it right here at the front. This SFARE marking stands for Sesión de la Fábrica d'Armi del Regio Esercito, the new name of the old Arsenal di Gardone Valtrompia, for anyone keeping track of Italian workshops. Now, why on earth was Italy still working on these guns? Well, that's because during the interwar period, Italy was one of the first nations to further nationalize with an emphasis on martial expansion. Troops became more specialized, and many more men under arms were not direct infantrymen, so the handguns were still needed. As a matter of fact, as late as 1930, Bernadelli was still being contracted for small lots of Bodeo revolvers, new made. It goes without saying that the Bodeo would therefore serve on through World War II, despite being long replaced by various Beretta designs. I mean, not only in 1915 and again in 1917, and then frankly every few years after until 1934, nope, the Bodeo was still cheap and available and right here for use. It was still on hand for NCOs, cavalry, horse artillery, ambulance drivers, machine gunners, and armored vehicle crews, widespread and frankly common through 1945. And after that, it served in the Carabinieri and the Guardia di Finanza into the 1950s before finally being phased out. And in that role, a curious set of variations actually appear that I do feel merit mentioning, even though they're not really core to our show today. The first is what is loosely known as the Model 1902, made specifically for the Guardia Finanza, and apparently also sold to the Ministry of the Interior. While it resembles a Type B Bodeo, the 1902 has a unique ejector rod swing, and the internals are from the Chamelot Delvine, including a lack of an Abadie gate. Now, I actually have a pet theory on that particular gun. You see, our man Bodeo was paid 15,000 lira for the licensing on his patents, and I've actually found reporting on a court case from about 1894 that covers an interesting dispute. Bodeo was suing the government for making illegal use of his patents. You see, he had negotiated pay for the unlimited production for the army needs. But the Financial Guard, the Ministry of the Interior, and various other state forces rather? No. Unfortunately, I don't know how this case turned out, and I can only find notes about it being ongoing. However, that would explain why the government would be adopting a near Bodeo that happens to skip over his critical patents, being the mechanism and the Abadie gate and the particular method of moving the ejector rod, eh? Later on, the patents would expire, which then explains why we see Finance and Interior marked standard Bodeo Type Bs, because now we can make them. That is, of course, theoretical. I don't know of proof of that. Now, another Bodeo variation appears in the early 1920s. This is generally known as the Model 89 lightened pattern, which was produced by MBT, the one that bought Glicenti. And Vittorio Castelli also got in on the action. I don't want to go into too much detail, but this was a shortened, radically lightened Bodeo pattern revolver in which nearly every dimension was reduced where possible. They also came to have a firing pin fixed in the frame like the Austrian Rostengasser. This Alleggerita was largely meant for police and security work, which is where most examples ended up. However, a small number are known to have turned up with military acceptance marks, so at least a few made it into standard service. Okay, we're almost there. I just have to have one final fact that I need to drop on all of you. The Bodeo and, interestingly, the 1874 Chamelot Delvine would both finally be dismissed from service in the same administrative act in 1969. It's 80 years of service. Well, I'm impressed. I certainly have a smattering of variations to talk about, so let's see how Mae feels about them all. All right, once more, we've made room for Mae and a delicious selection of revolvers.
Yeah, there is quite a lot of Bodeo on this table.
This is a flight of Italian revolvers.
Yeah.
Now, all of these are slightly different from each other, and we're going to need Mae to walk us through all of them, starting with, I believe, the Type A.
Yeah, Alpha.
Yes, which was a designation given to it, I believe, in 1915 or so. Normally, this would have been the Type Trooper. But
is it like Trooper Special?
Well, it's the trooper and the officers, and then it became the. I think what happened is once they started assigning the officers to whoever in the war, they were like, "Oh, I can't call it the officers. That's confusing." So they became the Type A and B. That would be my guess.
Okay, sure.
Okay,
Whatever works. That's how we're going to categorize them.
We have the Type A.
Okay.
What? Just first impression, looking at it, what's going on?
So this is really weird looking from the outset, and just. Because, like, I'm normally used to, standard revolver look outset. Like, it's got the cylinder, it's got the higher bore axis, which is not unlike a lot of revolvers that we shoot for the series. But then I get to everything down below the cylinder. This grip and this trigger. What is going on there?
The leg of lamb.
Yeah, I'm not super content with what I'm looking at when I'm first handed this one. I remember when we first shot this for the series, way back when, I was like, oh, that's going to be a pain in the ass. I know it is. Like, I just knew it was going to be fun.
Yeah, we've done some work, too, since that early episode, because we were pretty, we were trying real hard just to keep up with the basics of the show back then.
Yeah.
And we've had a lot more time to sit here and do things like service the trigger so that it works the way it should work, which is worse.
Nice. Yeah,
no, it's worse than it was.
No, it is worse, but yeah.
Yeah, because in the old one, we hadn't really readjusted this trigger yet. You could just pull it out and the trigger would fall and you're like, oh, good enough, and hook it.
Yeah.
But no, man. How do you get this trigger to drop?
You just do a little bit of a touch. A little delicate.
Right.
Like that, he just falls right out.
Yeah,
it's so cute.
You have to work the hammer.
Yeah. In order to actually release the trigger. Which, I mean, cool. They've made this sleek so that it really just, it folds up into itself so that it's out of the way, it's safe. I get what they were going for with that, but then you just have this weird floppy doodad down here.
But do you understand how much that reduced the ND into the leg situation that they're probably dealing with that resulted in this?
Just how many people were getting shot in the legs? I just want to know the number.
Probably more than we want to realize.
I don't want to know.
You've seen people who grew up handling guns in the 60s, 70s?
It's true. Fingers on the triggers all the time.
Yeah. Can you imagine the 1860s and 70s? There probably were actually a lot of...
this is actually a pretty heavy trigger pull. I'd be impressed if they managed to do it. It'd be more like... you get a little weird medal for that.
That finger on the trigger... Anyway, so, yeah, you have to manipulate the hammer to drop the trigger.
Right. Yep. Okay, I get that. But...
And then I see you're stuck on the grip.
Yeah, well, because this grip puts you in a weird freaking position because it pulls you all the way back to the rear, and there's not really much of a spur here on this knuckle to kind of help wedge me down. I don't have a trigger guard.
There is a spur.
Yeah, there is, but like it's contoured in such a way that it doesn't come over your hand. It really is very easy to slip up on this grip, which doesn't help you as the shooter.
If you put the web of your hand into that contour, you cannot reach the trigger in a comfortable way.
Not really, no. It's super awkward, and then unfortunately, it is a pretty heavy hammer, so you're fighting the ergonomics of the gun just to get it to work.
Yeah, just to cock it.
Right.
That grip, by the way, is much more reminiscent of, say, the Gasser 1870.
Kind of, yeah.
But then they went nuts and were like, let's put a deep rake on it. So it's almost like taking the...
What is going on here?
You look at the sort of... You look at like the earlier, more vertically gripped Colt pistols, and then that 1911 has that deep rake, and you're like, everybody's like, yeah, that feels good. I like that 1911 rake. Or like the Luger coming off the Borshardt.
Yeah.
Borshardt grip, Luger grip, right? Mm-hmm. And then they're like, yeah, let's do that to the Gasser 1870. And everybody didn't like that at all. Well, apparently the Italians liked it, but no normal people do. It is a bizarre to hear. This one's got the same grip. It feels better than it looks.
It does, yes.
The big problem I have with it is it puts your finger above the trigger.
Yep.
And you can't really you have to loosen up and come down, and now you have no support.
Which is what I had to do from the very beginning, and I thought, oh, okay, cool, I'll just grip it, I'll have to grip it low, it's gonna be a little bit annoying, but, you know, I think I can make that work, right? You know, and then, so I guess we need to talk about, that pretty much handles it.
No, we're talking about the grip, just go ahead and say it. You shoot the gun.
Yeah, you shoot the gun, okay, so.
And then you just slide.
Yeah, you just slide forward. You slide up, basically, every time. So I feel like I'm constantly losing my handle on this gun, but I'm not. I don't feel like I'm losing my handle. I feel like I'm just having to adjust my grip every single time I pull the dang trigger.
If you want to be remotely accurate.
Right.
Okay, so there's the grip. So let's discount the trigger. Let's discount the grip.
Okay.
What are you left with?
Well, effectively, we're left with, it's got a lot of... It has like what feels like it should be a fair bit of weight to the front of it, which, you know, is going to make it more muzzle heavy, which will be good for recoil. Like this is going to be better in the long run, I think.
It's a beefy boy.
Yeah. However, while we were shooting it, I did happen to notice that ever so slightly, this rod just sneaked out on us while we were filming on range.
Yeah, it depends on the gun. So the rod's held in with a flat spring, and as they get older, they just let
invariably
it go.
wear.
There's also not a proactive notch to retain the rod in its closed position that I was able to see. It's just to keep it from escaping the gun entirely.
Right.
Now,
which it does feel like it catches at some point. Like you can feel it reach a certain point, and it has an audible almost pop to it that you can feel and hear.
Right. Now that rod's part of the loading system and an unloading system.
Yes.
So this is an Abity gate loader.
Which, fantastic. I've got an Abity gate loader. I can rapidly load and unload this gun, and it actually does line up pretty well. Like I didn't have any issues with it.
I actually find the Bodeos to be easier to load. Well, I have an example size of one for Abities. I only handled one Abity and it had some damage. But the Bodeos are very slick Abity guns. I get it in my left hand, I get the gate open, and I pull and flick and pull and flick and pull, and I get a real rhythm.
It's pretty straight, because there's nothing, unlike what we had to do with the Abity, we had to worry about making sure that the rod went through the channel, and the channel has to be perfect.
And the rod is terrifying, and that the lever of it feels like it's going to snap off.
Right.
This one, it's weird. This looks flimsy as all get out.
Which it kind of is a little bit flimsy, but the thing is, it's very simple, though. Like, I don't have to worry about once I pop it out, oh no, I just push and pull. Like there's nothing that's restricting this or that's going to bind it.
It's a very thin rod, but it's all linear. There's not anything to break off unless you bend the rod itself.
Yes.
So I don't know. I found it okay.
Yeah, it wasn't bad.
Any problems loading?
I didn't think I had any issues with it. I can't remember having any particular issues. It's just the rod, like you said, it feels a little flimsy in the hand, but otherwise it functioned well enough.
I've also noticed a lot of these rod ejectors, you get to the rear and they don't always have enough. It's almost like you want to have another 1/4 inch of rod.
Just to pop it a little more.
But not these.
No, they seemed okay for the most part. I think I babied one eject once or twice, and that was me, not the gun, if I want to remember correctly.
I also want to point out, I remember filming these.
Oh.
These made the most... You know, there's just those little sensations of sound or motion that are just perfect?
Oh, right. They just kind of have this, like... It's music to your ears kind of thing, but with gun sounds.
Right, I believe you've called it kinesthetic joy.
Yes, that's a good way to put it.
Although this was more auditory.
Yeah, kind of like with the rolling block and how I just love the sounds of the clicking of the hammer and the breech and popping it open. Yeah, it just sounds so good.
I don't recall which one it was, but at least one, if not two of these, right when you got to the ejection stroke, it would go cling, like a perfect metallic cling.
It was a really positive sound. I think it happened to both of them.
All things aside, I just like there's little things that you just love about dealing with old
They
guns.
do sound pretty good. And then I know we're getting out of order with all this, but we're going to be doing this in a weird way. I want to make sure that I get all the details out on this one so that we can do a good comparison between the rest of them. The sights on this guy are actually not as terrible as I thought they would be.
You get the impression they're crude when you look at them.
Right, because it's this deep, it's not really a deep, it's kind of just like a U-notch, like chucked out of the rear, and then like a circle basically to
Like
fit
a
into
half
that.
circle.
Right,
I
essentially.
wouldn't even say a bead, but it's closely related to a bead.
Right.
I think it reads well.
It's not bad, it really isn't.
I thought it was going to be worse.
Now, granted, I think I still, just because of, like, the heavy trigger and, like, trying to make sure I kept everything on Like I had to, because I had to keep readjusting my grip. I think that I wasn't as accurate with as I could have been, but I don't think it had to do with the sights. I think the sights were fine with that.
The U-notch and half circle really work a lot better than, say, a V and inverted V.
Yes, I agree.
They were cleaner than they had any right to be.
Yes.
Okay, so, boy, we're all over now. I gotta follow this.
God.
The gun is, it's a chubby boy. It's got a bad grip, Abity gate loader, weird trigger. Okay.
Heavy hammer.
We go to actually fire the gun because we've talked about the grip in terms of recoil, but we really haven't talked the rest. So we get up there. How's the single action? Because I saw you struggling.
Well, like I said before, the hammer is a very heavy pull, and I honestly, you have to pre-position yourself just to manipulate the hammer on the gun in such a place that it just doesn't really feel quite right, especially with this knuckle back here. It feels like I should be much higher on the gun, but that just doesn't work. So I have to drop down in order to get a good position on the hammer. Okay. And then the single action pull, it's not bad. It's not light, but it's, it's okay.
I wouldn't call it like amazingly crisp.
No, it's just okay.
It's serviceable, and I feel like I could be accurate with it. At 30 feet,
at 30 feet with these sights, it'd be fine. Like, I think that the single action is doable on this guy. The double action is where it's killing you because not only is that trigger super heavy, but you have to pull this trigger so far back. I mean, I thought I was almost touching, actually I am almost touching my knuckle in here. I may have touched my knuckle like once or twice, my mid-knuckle.
If you watch on the high-speed footage, you can really see how far back that hand, like you crunch your own hand into this.
Pretty much.
Into this almost awkward position,
and you're crunching your hand back into like what is this weird angle
Swept
shape.
back,
It's awkward on the wrist, it's awkward on the hand, it doesn't feel good as you're going through.
So what you've done is you've put all of your grip on the gun all the way to the rear, way back here, and then way low of the bore.
You know what? You actually can't put your hand up any further because if you do, you get in the way of pulling the trigger back.
Yeah, so you're way back here, you're way low, way away from the bore, and then it goes bang.
Yeah.
How's that recoil, man?
It's more than what it should be. It really is. Like, I was not expecting it to be quite as lifting as it was.
Yeah, that 10.4 Italian ordnance shouldn't really be kicking harder than 45 or 455
Webley. Yeah.
I don't know if it should be even doing that. I'd have to check the numbers. But we should be at least in the ballpark of 455 Webley. And we are not.
I feel like I was like, am I going crazy here? Like, I remember thinking on range, I think you even talked about it briefly, just being like, there's something weird that just feels about that. But no, the cartridge was right. It's just, with this gun in this setup, you're right, being that far back, it's just ready to rock.
No, it's a lever. Like, it set itself up to tip over center, and so your recoil is high. Like, the actual recoil of the gun, the boom, not that high.
No.
The problem is it's all so high over center, and it's just like, brrr, and then you have to reset that guy. So your reset time is extremely high.
Right. And that's where, like, I didn't think I was as accurate as I would have liked to have been, because I was still trying to be smooth on camera, make sure my pull-throughs looked even. And
fighting the double action.
Oh, God. Like, I think during one take, like, in particular, I was just like, I barely got it, but I was shaking on one of them, I know.
Yeah.
Good God.
So, your favorite revolver.
Oh, so favorite.
Now, before we get into the assessment, actually, we do have to do a comparison.
That's true.
So, that's the Type A.
Yep.
The Type B, this one has a DeLauzo safety, but this had no effect on you, right? Like, you didn't even perceive the DeLauzo safety. It doesn't.
I can't say I did. Like, I can't say I felt it.
It's out of the rim of your grip.
I personally didn't nudge up against it at all.
Right.
So, then again, I have smaller hands than you. Maybe you would have had a different experience.
I've never noticed it.
Okay.
The one trick is it has the trigger guard.
Right. And I'm thinking, I got a trigger guard. I'm thinking it's going to help me because I can put my middle finger up against it and use that as an extra place of purchase to get a good grip.
For those of you who've seen the Repercussion series, we talked about this with the Patterson revolvers.
Yes.
So effectively, you have a Patterson here.
Yeah, and I'm like, oh, sweet. Oh, boy, I've got the trigger guard. That's totally going to help. Here's where I am. I'm not near the trigger guard. Right. At all.
And before you say it's for delicate hands.
Yeah, maybe it's delicate for woman hands.
Let me get lined up. I'm going to get where I can pull the trigger. Hold on. Okay, that's the pull. I'm not touching the trigger guard.
No, you're not touching it either.
There's no hug up.
Thank you for nothing.
It does one thing.
Well, yeah.
It means that whenever it recoils and it slips in your grip,
it bumps your finger.
only go so far.
Yeah, it's true.
So you can at least get back to center a little faster as you fight it for every shot.
That is true. You absolutely can do that. And then on top of that, I guess technically, you don't have to have this fold-up trigger because now you've got a nice trigger guard there. That's.
Oh, yeah. Okay, same trigger though, single and double action.
No real difference, unfortunately. I was hoping there'd be some.
So would you say that there was any effective? Let me check the trigger pull. Hold on. Maybe.
I did not feel a difference. Although I don't think I'm pulling it back as far.
It doesn't go back as far.
Yeah, okay.
Which might explain why you had a slightly better time with this one than the other one.
That is true. It technically was slightly better. It's still slight. How is it still slight?
Like you're overheating.
Yeah, I'm just like,
trying to find
I'm like not happy with it regardless. Like I still had like not the best recoil with it. I think the sights were exactly the same too.
Yeah, they're the same.
Yeah, exactly the same.
Yeah, there's no difference otherwise.
Hooray.
Okay. Cool. Now we're down to, actually, no, let's hold off on number 3 because this one's more differenter than the other two.
More different.
Let's get your assessment of the Bodeo before we go into the Shamlo Bodeo. Is this a comfortable firearm for use in combat?
So really what you're asking me here is, would I bet my life on a Bodeo? I'm going to call that a Bodon't, not a Bodoo.
That didn't even make sense. It's not even a pun. What did you do?
I guess I did the same thing I always do, which does not quite make any sense. No, I honestly cannot see myself wanting or ever hoping to have to rely on either of these Bodeos. It is just ergonomically a nightmare to have to use. And unfortunately, even though the Bravo is technically a little bit better than the Alpha, it's not that much better. It's still got that super heavy trigger pull. The hammer is like incredibly difficult to operate with that grip. The grip really breaks everything. If you improve the grip, this would be leaps and bounds. But then the problem is that with that trigger pull, it goes so far back on the Alpha, you can't do anything. The grip is exactly where it needs to be. So you're stuck with that thing. I'm mad.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I'm
so
mad.
Yes, I heard yes. Yes to the Bodeo.
No to the Bodeo.
You'd rank it in your top 5 revolvers?
He's just trying to goad me at this point.
Okay, devil's advocate. I think the Bodeo is the best handgun of the entire war.
Well, you're wrong. Goodbye. Goodbye. Get out. Go somewhere else.
If you think of a war of attrition, this not the folding trigger version. Forget that.
Yeah,
right?
Forget that one.
And not necessarily
the
DeLauze safety is lousy. We'll take the second Viteo safety.
DeLauze?
They had second Viteo safeties in the officer models.
You're not even gonna acknowledge
I already did that earlier. It's the same.
did you?
You stole my pun.
You did it?
Yeah.
I don't remember you doing it.
You were here when we filmed it.
Oh God, I don't even remember.
Yeah. See, she didn't pay attention when I talk.
No.
So we. A properly updated officer's model, right, is an iron-framed gun with steel cylinder, steel barrel, steel plug for
it does have. I remember you talking about a steel plug. See, I listen sometimes, and the Navy had 11 millimeters.
So
and
it uses a minimum amount of precious resources. It is infinitely easy to produce because of the soft iron construction. That makes it inexpensive and rapid to deploy.
Okay.
If I'm honest, the number one failure of the Bodeo is the grip angle.
Yeah, that's what I said.
I think if you cleaned up this grip angle, it would solve a lot of problems with this gun.
It absolutely would. Like the hammer would be easier to operate, even though you wouldn't change any of the pressure required to operate it.
And then, of course, the reason that they kept it in the cartridge it was in is to not change horses midstreams. The cartridge was working okay.
Sure.
It wasn't a priority because it's a handgun cartridge. But if you imagine something like this updated to, say, 38 Smith & Wesson even, which is sort of anemic, but it would shrink the gun a lot. And then you get my point.
Right.
There's a genius to the Bodeo. The problem is, as an individual person, you don't want to have been subjected to what... There's a joke, right? So in the modern AR market, people like to laugh because they'll say mil-spec. And the problem is when you hear mil-spec, you forget to remind yourself that means it's the quality of the lowest cost bidder. That's the joke, right?
Okay.
This is the lowest cost bidder. Like, I don't know of a handgun from World War I
that costs less to produce.
Except for now you could get into the Ruby 32 made in Spain, right? That's getting close, but it still has a separate magazine with a spring that is more expensive and blah, blah, blah.
And you can't swap those mags.
Right. Well, you can't swap a lot of parts on these either. These are fairly hand-done, too. Mm-hmm. This is a cottage industry gun almost. Not that it was done that way.
But the Ruby's semi-auto.
Yeah. But that comes way later.
Oh, that's true.
And then it's one of those things. It is a gun that was consciously made almost Spanish quality before the need to involve Spain. And it lasted all the way through World War II because Italy was always short on cash, right? They had imperial goals, but they didn't have an imperial budget. And so the reason you see it stick along so long is because not only is it just there, it's super easy to service, and it's super easy to make more of them, and you're really not shooting your handgun all that often. You know what I mean? Like,
no, you are correct. You're not shooting it very often. And then for adrenaline use with that thing, I imagine it would be easier to operate.
Yeah, you're using it at like dead on, short distance, just, oh God, boom, 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 right? And then for nothing else, or let's be honest, if you're handing it out to officers, a lot of times it's being used for disciplinary action, in which it doesn't matter if it's good or bad.
Right.
Like, in terms of sheer magnitude, if I'm an army, I would probably choose something like this. As much as it would offend people, and especially my soldiers, it would be a huge cost savings that I could then put into, and we kind of had this in a Q&A that we had more recently.
Right.
It's a cost savings that I could put somewhere else that's way more important, like light machine guns. So why would I want to have a super fancy Colt whatever when I could have 1/5 more light machine guns when we multiply it by 1 million soldiers?
When you put it into that perspective, it is quite ingenious, but they really do need to fix that grip.
The Bodeo is probably the worst handgun that I love because of how simple it is. And it works.
It does work.
It's not just that it's simple, it's that it's simple and it worked. And that there's a mad genius there and I love it. All right, so now that I've praised that, let's talk about something that's even worse than a Bodeo, potentially.
Oh, yeah.
What happens when you make a Bodeo out of another gun?
Shamlo Bodeo.
Right, a Shamlo Delvine 1874 that has been transformed into a Bodeo because we didn't want to get the parts together.
Right.
Ergonomically, what is different here?
So, first off, the trigger actually on this one, not quite as bad. It really isn't. I think it has a lot to do with this grip because this grip is slightly different. I mean, look at that palm swell right there. Like, it is
designed for a human hand.
Yeah, they actually thought about it, and it does help. I don't nearly have to adjust as much with this one on range. I mean, I did a little bit, but it wasn't as bad, which was nice. Great improvement there.
And yet, I saw you try to cock that hammer.
It's still pretty heavy.
It's still almost worse.
It's heavier. Oh, yeah, it's heavier than the Bodeo.
I don't know if it's just the spring or
I still don't know how I actually cocked it. Like, I'm still, like, we were actually playing it here, like, on camera. It's actually still incredibly difficult.
We're in Patterson land. I have nothing to brace against for trigger guard.
Nothing.
And then trying to find somewhere to be on this is somehow even worse than the Bodeo.
Yeah.
And you're trying not to pull your own trigger, and you're
trying to give your trigger clearance to drop.
Yeah, it's awful.
It's just terrible.
Single action on this Shamlo Bodeo is awful.
Getting past that hammer.
Double action, actually more pleasant than those guys.
Yeah, I would agree. It actually is. Like, it's slightly easier to handle. And again, I say this grip definitely made a difference with that.
How does the weight feel? Like, here, get another one in your hand.
Okay.
What? Weight and balance. Now, don't forget, being the naval pattern, this has a slightly longer barrel. And by the way, it would have had an even more longer barrel if it had been an original 74, but they did shorten them ever so slightly to bring them into the same length as their Bodeo 89s.
Maybe I'm crazy. It feels like the Shamlo Bodeo is actually a little more muzzle heavy.
Well, yeah, it's got a longer barrel.
Oh, yeah, okay.
It also has more architecture at the front.
Oh, yeah, it definitely has more weight with the whole ejector rod, which this does look way more robust in terms of an ejector rod. Like, it definitely doesn't look quite as flimsy as this rod over here.
Yeah, this thing is heavy. I mean, it doesn't take in account at least half of the lightning procedures that went into making the Bodeo. Remember, the 74s were too heavy. That's why this process started. Yeah. So this is a heavy gun.
Clipping out the ejector rod, good God, there's a lot of force required to get past that hump there, isn't there?
Yeah, I've never been a huge fan of Shamlo ejector rods.
Yeah.
But
and this is supposed to be like the Avity system with this, right?
Oh, open the gate.
Yeah, okay.
Now pull the trigger.
Yeah, okay. Pop the trigger down.
No, let's see. Do it. Yep. Your hammer moves a little bit, but it doesn't fire. Like, it doesn't cock.
You can even see it on range, though. it doesn't quite line up.
Right.
With the rod.
Well, because the Shamlo was never designed to have the Bodeo system. And apparently, now sample size of 1,
It just doesn't line up.
I don't think they could time the revolver to get it to line up with the cylinder properly for firing, but then also have the next chamber line up with the ejector
So it's like,
rod.
well, it's got to go boom, so it's got to line up there.
The Shamlows are not designed to have the ejection port line up when the firing port's lined up. You know what I mean? So the Bodeo system works.
Yeah.
But you still have to manually index the last little bit. Now, I will say for loading, you can get away with it because the round nose bullet, you can get in there and just sort of...
That is just crazy to me, though, that it has this Abity system set up, and it's like, and I'm so expecting it, like the other Abity systems, to just be so great and perfect and fast. And then, no, you have to adjust the cylinder every single time.
Yep.
That's such a letdown.
So it's heavier. The Abity system doesn't really work.
Hooray.
And it's harder to cock the hammer, but it's slightly easier to pull the trigger.
Right, and this grip is slightly better.
So hard, yes.
What is wrong with you? No, it still gets a no.
Is it better or worse than a Bodeo?
Wait, I think the Bodeo Bravo is the best out of these three. I think the Bodeo Bravo is the best out of these 3, technically, if I think about it.
I'd love to get a hold of one of the lightened ones or one of the other commercial ones and see if it's any better than that.
Now, I will say, if the Abity system actually did work on this one, I might consider it.
Really?
Yeah.
Just because of the grip?
Well, no, I might consider it better than the Bodeo Bravo.
What I don't understand is why I understand why, because they wanted to make everything uniform. Mm-hmm. So they made it have the folding trigger because they only adopted the A pattern. Mm-hmm. But that, if they had just not bothered to do the folding trigger
and just
left,
unnecessary.
By the way, they could have left the original trigger guard and everything on there.
Yeah, that'd have been great.
Yeah, I know.
Fine. I'd had something to push up against, but instead I got nothing, and I got a heavier hammer.
Yeah.
What is happening?
I don't know. Yeah, it's super wild.
I'm telling you, Bodeo knows.
No, that's not a pun. You're not doing that. That's not becoming a thing.
Okay.
Okay, anyway. Overall, I love these guys. They turn up in the collector's market fairly often. I think there's a lot of history there. There's a lot of collector's value.
You get to find appreciation and love for these pieces because you go into all of the history and stuff.
Right.
Meanwhile, my first experience with them is usually just shooting them. So I'm just like, God, these are horrible. And he's like, but there's wonderful. Let me tell you all about them.
They don't rank very highly when you're being shot at and you need to shoot back accurately.
No, they don't.
But when you're just some dude hanging out at the range, piddling with an old gun, they're super cool.
You know what? They're unique. They're cool. I think if I had no concept of these guns and I saw somebody on range with it, I'd be curious. I'd find it unique.
Yeah, but these almost look like Fred Flintstone's personal handgun.
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah. So I love them. May's not so sold, but that's okay because you've learned something about the Bodeo today.
Oh no.
All right, if you enjoy this kind of content, of course, give us your support however you can by sharing the videos or by stopping by C&Rsenal.com. If you'd like to know what's going on, we always do a little update after the credits. Mm-hmm. And then otherwise, we'll see you next time.
Bye, everybody.
Alright gang, for tonight's update, I need to tell you that the next episode is going to be late. It'll be replaced with a previous project that has only been released to patrons. Sorry patrons, but you guys especially know what is eating up our time, and as soon as we can have that issue resolved, we can get back to semi-normal. But in the meantime, unfortunately, just May and I are the only two that are at this full-time, and we cannot make the hours happen to do both the episodes and clean up a little bit of a paperwork mess. So, while we're getting that resolved, I apologize, but we'll be back at it as fast and as hard as we can.